Our first presenter of the morning will be Dr. Drew Lopenzina. Dr. Drew is a professor of English literature and the director of MA English program at Old Dominion University. In his presentation, it's named This is Tsenacomoco, Marking New Narratives of Indigenous Presence in Virginia Public Spaces.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I just want to say that I want to thank Dr. May Edwards for inviting me here today. It is an honor to be here. It's an honor to be here in the presence of the chiefs and the tribal members and VTEC and all the educators who are here as well today. So I thank you for allowing me to be a part of this today. I want to start, so this image right here is taken from a map that was painted by John White, who was one of the early Roanoke visitors to this place. And I think it's just an interesting image as it literally sort of documents visually that moment that Chief Adams was just talking about, that is, from a European perspective, that moment of discovery. And if you drew back from this painting, it's a much larger map, and you'd see the whole Raleigh expedition that's coming here to settle. But it marks a moment where that expedition is coming here, but in a sense viewing the land prior to colonization. And so I want to think about the ways that today we can begin to decolonize that history together. If I can just figure out how to work this. I want to start, so I'm going to quickly move through this, but I wanted to ask how many of you here in this audience today are aware of somebody named William Apis? Yeah. And so I'm not surprised. I think I saw 3 hands go up. And I just want to say, so William Apis has been the subject of a lot of my research, and often when I talk in front of audiences like this, I remember our former president said, for instance, that Frederick Douglass was doing a lot of great work lately and should get more recognition. I feel the same way about William Apis, a 19th century Pequot. Let me bring it up on the board. He was an author and a Methodist minister, and he is regarded as the first Native person to begin publishing book-length histories, memoirs, and other forms of advocacy, really, for Native people. His first book, A Son of the Forest, appeared in 1829. He goes on to write 4 more books over the next decade advocating for indigenous causes. He helped to orchestrate what was known as the 1833 Mashpee Resistance in what is now Cape Cod in Massachusetts to establish the civil rights, in fact, the sovereignty of the Mashpee tribe to give them the right to organize and govern themselves. And he becomes a forceful and controversial public speaker, filling meeting houses, lecture halls, public spaces where he lobbied for the rights of Native people, for African Americans as well. And he did this over the next decade, and I imagine would have continued to do it brilliantly had he not died in 1839. I only bring him to your attention because, first of all, we're all educators. I'd like you all to start teaching about William Apis. He's really a fascinating and dynamic figure in a time when most of us don't even realize that Native people are writing and engaging white audiences at this time in such a forceful and generative manner. But I also want to talk just briefly because when I started doing research on William Apis, I went to the town of Coleraine, and I know William Apis was born there simply because in his own memoir he said, I was born in this little town of Coleraine, which when he was born there in 1798 was a town of about 1,100 people. And today, some 200 and something years later, it is still a town of about 1,100 people. It hasn't changed, but when I went there and began my research, I realized there wasn't a single mention of William Apis anywhere in this town. I went through all of their documents, the town clerk's office, the library. This town was amazing in the way that they had curated their own history, and yet no mention of who I think should be their most famous native son. And so I thought, how could I change that? And in the most productive manner, perhaps. And so over a number of years, I worked to not only talk to the town, address the town, go to the town council, and I lobbied for the right to put this marker in the center of town, honoring the fact that William Apis was born there. And the whole town showed up for this event. The indigenous community came to be there at the time. We had Ron Welburn, who helped to start the Native American and Indigenous Studies program at the University of Massachusetts. Lisa Brooks is standing right behind me there, who some of you may know her work, The Common Pot. She's an Abenaki historian who recently won the Bancroft Prize in History, which is the highest prize that historians can win in America today. And various other people from the indigenous community there were all on board for this ceremony and for the unveiling of the sign. And that's the memorial that we put up there. And the town actually lobbied together after that, unbeknownst to me, and made May 22nd William Apis Day. and so we actually now honor William Apis every day in Coleraine. And this was a tribe of Mashpee Wampanoag because William Apis helped the Mashpee Wampanoag gain their sovereignty in the 1830s. A delegation came by to celebrate William Apis Day with us last year. And so this is a way of thinking about how do we think of history? What is history? Who gets to tell it? There are a lot of people today who believe that history is somehow something that's just sitting there fully formed in the past, and it's just the job of historians to bring it forward. But in fact, I believe history is comprised of narratives and various different stories, and as we all know, some of those stories get told, some of those stories do not get told, some of those stories get told in ways that are not helpful to all of us. In other words, who gets privilege and who does not when we tell history. And we've been telling the history of this area for quite some time. John Smith started writing about it in 1609 in his 1624 General History of Virginia. This was an image that he apparently illustrated of his adventures in this area, including the Pocahontas story, which if you blink, you'd miss it, but that's right down here in this little panel. And we've been telling this history and thinking about it in different ways over the years. It's a history that is self-serving for white colonists who came here and took over this space. We tell it as a romance. Most of us actually get our history from Walt Disney, so it's not surprising that, in fact, when I teach, this is how most of my students understand history. And although most of us may have think there was a romance between John Smith and Pocahontas, those who watch Disney's Pocahontas 2 know that it's a little more complicated than that. However, the story of Pocahontas that we don't tell and that rarely gets told is the fact that Pocahontas, this isn't a love story, right? Pocahontas was kidnapped in 1612 by Captain Samuel Argall. She was brought aboard his ship under the pretense that she was going to visit the ship and just see what was going on there, I guess, and she was invited on board. This is a print that was published in 1618 that shows 3 stages where she's being invited aboard the ship. I can't find the little red dot here, but it's somewhere. And then here it is, she's being taken to the ship, and then she's held captive there. And in fact, she spent over a year in captivity, and her choice to ultimately marry John Rolfe can't really be considered one of romance, but instead this is one of captivity. It's coercion, it's violence. It's the part of the story that we bury in the romance, right? And Pocahontas was converted to Christianity in this time. Again, something that under these circumstances we have to understand as something that happens through coercion, not through choice. And this story manages to make its way into the Capitol Rotunda where this painting sits today and is part of our sort of panoramic wallpaper, the story that we want to tell about America, minus all the violence, the coercion, the captivity, right? Pocahontas did go to England in 1615, I believe, or 1616, and this is an actual, this painting comes from an engraving that was made of her that she actually sat for at the time, so it's the closest likeness that we have of her. But all this to say, behind this romance, Pocahontas, the idea was that she would come back to America with John Rolfe, and they would start a school for children. And so in a way, there's ideas about indigenous education and VTEC are seated in this very story, and yet Pocahontas died aboard ship in Gravesend, England, and never made her way back home. And there she rests today in an unknown grave. But John Rolfe did come back, and he helped to begin the tobacco industry here, which instead of ultimately the story being a romance, it's one that tells about violence against Native people and the introduction of slavery into the area of Virginia. And all of this gets sort of gets wrapped over or is vanished through this idea of a romance. So telling history 100 years ago, or I should say in 1907, however long ago that was, this is how the Jamestown expedition was being memorialized. And then 100 years later, George Bush came along to the Jamestown area, and he said, from our own history, we know the path to democracy is long and it's hard. There are many challenges and there are setbacks along the way, yet we can have confidence in the outcome because we've seen freedom's power to transform societies. He said that the United States must stand with those struggling to gain their freedom. Today, democratic institutions are taking root in places where liberty was unimaginable not long ago. In other words, George Bush's version of this history was one of democratic progression, as though the whole story of Jamestown was somehow a story of democracy moving forward and bringing freedom to people in ways that, advancing freedom in ways that, as he said, are the greatest story of our time. I'm interested and invested in the way that we tell this story as educators. If you were to go to Fort Story in Virginia Beach today, and it's the site where they say the first landing took place, where the Jamestown expedition came in 1607, and there is a marker there. And people go to these public markers believing that they're in the presence of history, that you're going to go there, you're going to go with your kids, your family, your dog, and they're going to read the marker and understand that this is what happened. And so much of what we understand is embedded in these kinds of versions of history throughout the country. Part of the marker reads, these God-fearing people fell down on their knees when they reached land, thanked God for their safe voyage, all well and good. Before them lay the vast American wilderness known as Virginia. This is history. This is the way that history is being told on a marker like this. Except already of violence is being done, right? In other words, was this a vast wilderness? Was it even known as Virginia? Captain Christopher Newport, the commander of the expedition, went with a party to explore this land filled with, as it says, fair meadows, fresh waters, and goodly tall trees. In other words, this land was a place of resources for the taking, empty land where explorers could discover and come here and take the things that they needed to make the profit that they could sell back, ship back to England, and make money from. And, there was one other aspect of that, and then the only thing it mentions of the actual people who lived here is that near the end of the day, an encounter with Indians left 2 of the party wounded. Of all the things that might have been said, perhaps, of that first encounter, what we have is this random act of violence with no explanation behind it. That encounter, in fact, took place with the Nansemond tribe, as we learned from John Smith in his own voluminous writings. So, was Virginia really part of a vast American wilderness? This is the way that Americans continued to depict it for years to come and right into our own time. This is a painting from 1836, Thomas Cole, that's meant to show the vast American landscape as this kind of savage, unruly place. And as more settlers appear, this idea that America, these colonies that are being carved out, stretch as far as the eye can see, all the way to, well, they don't even know because they haven't been there yet. But that this land can just be claimed, that you could just draw your borders off into infinity because there's nothing there, presumably, to stop it. I want to step back from all of that for a second. I want to see if we can think about removing all the lines and borders and names that Europeans have projected upon this place. And this map was created by Lisa Brooks, the Abenaki historian I referred to earlier, that just wanted to think about what did this continent look like as native space, as a space that's constituted of waterways and networks of rivers that connected communities and people and kinship networks and villages. And understand that native space was never an isolated space of people living in tiny pockets and chasing down deer and antelope or buffalo or whatever. But in fact, there were networks that expanded all the way across this continent. We know from this particular archaeological dig that you could find in this one place in Ohio examples of shark teeth that had come over from the Atlantic Ocean, silver that was coming down from the areas of Quebec and Montreal, copper from the Great Lakes, grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains, and other things, all in one site in Ohio. This is going back actually a couple thousand years to show that trade existed throughout this continent in ways that we aren't normally told or isn't normally part of the way that we're educated on this. I don't know how many of you have heard of Cahokia. I'll take a show of hands again if you have. Quite a few more of you, which is good, but I still think this really isn't being taught. We're not being educated. That long before settlers, European settlers, ever got here, there were these basically urban meccas, this one particularly right in the center of America. This is where St. Louis is today, on the other side of the Mississippi River. One of the most fertile areas in the world, as a matter of fact, and this community holding up to 20,000 people, circa 800 to 1400 AD, was easily as large as any European city in the time. And they obviously did not sustain themselves through hunting game or buffalo and deer, but they had agricultural practices. They had to. In fact, their agriculture was so successful that they had surplus agriculture that they could trade amongst other like communities scattered throughout the north, or at least the eastern seaboard and beyond. And so we don't learn about these things in our school. It's interesting because it's still there. You can go visit it today. That's the visitor center at Cahokia, which is a National Heritage Site today. And you can still see it. It's there, it's undeniable. I've talked to students who are from St. Louis who live right across the river. You can practically see the arch from the top of that mound, which I've been on top of, who don't know that it even exists. And I think that's true for all Americans. In other words, as far as our education is concerned, this whole history is just wiped off the map. It's as though it never existed. John White, when he first came here to Roanoke in the 1580s, what did he see when he first came here? But indigenous people and fortified villages and just fields and fields of corn and other agricultural products. It's interesting that we often are told that Native people were not an agricultural people. You'll see this in the history that was written about it by white settlers over and over again, and yet there it always is anyways. They can say in the same breath they're not an agricultural people, and we just traded for more corn because we would have starved if we hadn't. Not a single colony would have survived without surplus indigenous agriculture. More John White pictures, how he saw this space when he first got here. And John Smith made this map, and it's really interesting to me. This is one of those early maps of Virginia that, if nothing else, shows what he saw as Virginia as a world populated by villages. All these little named spaces on this map are native villages that go up and down the waterways. And so this space, Virginia, was not an empty space, as the sign says at Fort Story. This was a populated space. My understanding is that Tsenacomoco itself means, I've seen it translated as densely populated place, probably means like a village world, a place of many villages, something along those lines. And yet, only a few decades later, another map in 1667 by John Farrar shows the exact same space, and it's really interesting the transformation that's already begun to take place. All those native villages are no longer on the map. Instead, we see little animals populating what we apparently are to understand as wilderness spaces. This is the way that we erase indigenous presence from the field, from not just the story and the narrative, from the very representations, the map, the land itself. John Smith, in 1624, wrote the General History of Virginia. That's where we get the story of Pocahontas and the rescue. But his first actual writings about this place came out in 1608, a report to the Virginia Company investors called A True Relation. And I want to go back to that first landing and what it says on that marker. John Smith wrote, anchoring in this bay, 20 or 30 went ashore with the captain, and in coming aboard they were assaulted with certain Indians, which charged them within pistol shot, in which conflict Captain Archer and Matthew Morton were shot, whereupon Captain Newport, seconding them, made a shot at them, which the Indians little respected, and so on and so on. This is where that account comes from. When you look at that sign, when you're reading that history, all right, it is in the history books. It's there in the archive. That is history because John Smith told us that's what happened. He wasn't there. He was actually being held prisoner on the ship when it was going on. Another long story. But nevertheless, we don't know why this encounter happened. We can't read into it so much, but my guess, if I had to hazard a guess, is that it was the English who instigated it and not the Nansemond. We certainly have many other incidents where the English instigated such battles, but we also know this, and this is what's interesting to me, because if you were to read that account in A True Relation of Virginia that John Smith wrote, in that very same paragraph that he said we had this encounter, the same paragraph, he writes, the country, for the most part, on each side is plain high ground with many fresh springs. The people in all places kindly, entreating us, dancing and feasting us with strawberries, mulberries, bread, fish, and other their country provisions, whereof we had plenty. And after in our journey they often met us, trading with us for such provisions as we had. It's amazing to think about this encounter, the one that's not on the sign, the one that could be but isn't. That the English were greeted with this kind of hospitality. It's fascinating to even think of John Smith and his crewmen dancing with the local inhabitants and being feasted and fed and provided. We could tell that story, but we choose not to. And if you were to continue just other events of the same, when we learned the werewants of Rappahannock came down to the waterside with all his train, as goodly men as I've ever seen, savage or Christian, he entertained us in so modest a proud fashion, as though he had been a prince of civil government, holding his countenance without laughter or any such ill behavior. He caused his mat to be spread on the ground, where he sat down with great majesty. George Percy wrote this, the same person who later took place in the events that Chief Adams was talking about with the Paspahegh, I believe. And again, the rest of his people and ourselves followed him up a steep hill where his palace was settled. We passed through the woods and fine paths, having most pleasant springs which issued from the mountains. We went through the goodliest cornfields that was ever seen in any country. When we came to Rappahannock's town, he entertained us in good humanity. So we have two stories on the table, basically two histories. They were assaulted with certain Indians which charged them within pistol shot, in which conflict Captain Archer and Matthew Morton were shot. The people in all places kindly entreating us, dancing and feasting us with strawberries, mulberries, bread, fish, and other their country provisions, whereof we had plenty. Why do we tell one story and not the other? Why do we privilege one story over the other? What is the violence that's done when this is the story we tell over and over and over again? I brought together a number of my students a few years back. I believe this was in 2018 at the 1619 Making of American Conference at Norfolk State University. And my students and I had looked into this issue and had decided we were going to present to the Virginia National Park Service a rationale and a model for how to change the language on that sign, because I believe it starts there. For me, that sign is mile marker 0. That's where history begins to be told in a public way in the state of Virginia. And along with my students here, Tijuana Reeves, J.C. Litz, Priya Jayatalaki, and Brian Hicks, who had done so much of the work for me in sort of putting some of this together, we managed to put together a presentation and contact, it was Kim Hall at the time, who was the director of the U.S. National Park Service in Virginia. And we had a whole petition. That petition is still up, and you can look at it today if you want to sign it. It's something that I hope to actually resurrect again. But all this to say that we actually went to Kim Hall, we gave her the presentation, and she was excited about it, and she wanted to change that language. And then COVID hit, and the parks closed down. And when I finally sort of got my own footing again and contacted the parks again, Kim Hall was gone, and the next representative proved to be unresponsive, and so that's where it sits. Nevertheless, I think herein lies a beginning, at least. How do we begin to start to tell the story? And if we can get the beginning, if that becomes has more integrity, is more acknowledging of Indigenous presence on these lands, we can move forward from there. So thank you all for listening. I also forgot to say, thank you, one last thing. And so ODU is having a symposium next week at Old Dominion University, what we're calling a Land Acknowledgement Symposium. And I hope this is a place where we continue this conversation, and I really welcome everybody who will be coming there to participate in this conversation, to think how we can all move forward together in how we're teaching these materials.
Carry on, I'm sorry.
No, I'm finished, but thank you all. I really appreciate it. I mean, if you have more questions, I'll stand up here longer, but, okay, thanks.
Okay. Next up, we have our very own Miss Haley Holmes. She's from the Chickahominy Indian Tribe and the VTEC CTE project director, and she will give a presentation on the Career and Technical Education Grant.
Good morning. My name is Haley Holmes, and I am the project director for the Career and Technical Education program. This grant was awarded to us in October of 2021. It is a $3.5 million grant. It is 5 years, and we are in year 1. What is career and technical education? Career and technical education is the practice of teaching specific tech-based and career-oriented skills to students. Our goal is to prepare Native American students to meet academic and technical standards for high-skill, high-wage, and in-demand industry sectors. Ways that we can assist are financially, academically, and through mentorship. This program is open to Native students grades 6 and up, and what we can do is provide assistance to students to excel in CTE. Some of the ways that we do that is through financial assistance. That may be covering transportation costs, covering application fees. We can cover books, laptops, and other individualized aid. Academically, we can assist through career exploration, work-based learning activities or exercises, career awareness, and soft skills training. Along with that, our academic coordinators will provide preparatory services, refreshers, and remedial education services with the help of our partners. We are partnered with Code Virginia, Code VA, the Virginia Department of Education, and local education agencies. Code VA serves as the national developer of a model for online synchronous delivery of this typically in-person professional development. Code VA believes that every child or teen has the right to code and has the fundamental right to computer science literacy. We have worked with Code VA to provide specialized programs for VTEC member tribes. These programs include a computer science academy where we'll be working with students to develop a website or app based on some research they will collect from a topic of their choice. This will take place in the summer of 2023. One of the others is Critter Code. During our Critter Code camp, students will design their own critter that they will eventually be starred in their own video game. Along with that, we have developed some computer science lessons for teachers to take to their classroom, focusing on Native American topics and issues. Code VA is also offering free youth classes through Eureka workshops, and to do that, you can email Betsy, and she will give you the code, and those classes will be free. So we're very, very thankful for the work that Code VA is doing for us. We have been connecting with some high schools in the Commonwealth to track down Native students in the school systems that are in need of our assistance. Some of those schools being Albemarle County, Amherst County, and some of the others are Richmond Public Schools, Roanoke County, Hanover County, Williamsburg, King William, York County, Prince George. The list is endless. And our hope is to connect with all schools in Virginia before it's all said and done. With all of that being said, during these 5 years and after, students will have gained a post-secondary credential, skills in an in-demand occupation, preparatory, refresher, and remedial education services, and they would have received and experienced career exploration. Ways that we can provide additional assistance is through offering a stipend and scholarship match contribution for eligible students. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to come up and ask, or you can email me. My email is here at the bottom, haleyholmes@vtecinc.org. And thank you.